Whoever said fork in the road must have been hungry for the Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid. Their 3-row seating and 10-year, 100,000-mile limited powertrain warranty. With a capable Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid, every way forward is the right way. Visit your local Kia dealer today. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Drive safely. See retailer for warranty details.
Try Angel Soft for your tushy. It's made by angels. Soft and strong, budget friendly. The choice is simple. A roll that feels like paradise, and always at a heavenly price. Angel Soft, Angel Soft. Soft and strong, so it's simple. Pick up a pack today.
Angel Soft.
Soft and strong, simple.
Hi there, and welcome again to the Explaining History podcast. Yesterday we were talking about Congo and the extraction of wealth from Congo, firstly under the Belgians, and then under the kind of the neo-colonial relations that developed during and after the Second World War, primarily to benefit America's domestic economy and its weapons program. And it got me thinking a lot about the kind of transitions, 20th century transitions in colonial relations and the nature of colonial capitalism and kind of post-colonial capitalism. And I think there's a lot to say about that, really. If you look at it from a kind of Marxist perspective, looking at what Marx, Lenin, J.A. Hobson, who was a liberal, from whom Lenin gained a lot of his ideas, and Rosa Luxemburg, the way in which the purposes of empire, as far as capital is concerned, is the pursuit of profits, of returns. You're looking for cheap resources and labour markets. And this has a number of effects on the metropole country, the country at the periphery, the imperial periphery, the imperial core, sorry. In this case, let's take the example of Great Britain. Great Britain, when selling opium or kind of imposing opium on China, sees this kind of explosive growth because this substance is used to extract enormous wealth from China, tear Chinese society kind of apart. It paid for the financing in part of the Royal Navy. It paid for huge expansions of Britain's towns and cities, the amount of wealth that poured from China into Britain is quite staggering, just as the amount of wealth that pours from the rest of the world into Britain as a result of Britain's capture of slave labour and its selling of sugar and cotton and other items as a result of the slave trade. So what this does is it leads to industrial transformation. Britain in the kind of 16th and 17th centuries is a fairly, in global terms, at best could be described as a middle-ranking nation. Quite a violent diseased island. It's wealthier than certain parts of Europe, but it becomes a global power through the capture of markets and through the capture of raw materials. Okay, so far so straightforward. And the transitions in the Indian cotton trade particularly are very, very instructive. When the British passed laws in India to prevent domestic cotton production, they turned India from a producer to a consumer state, and money, India was at that point, though it might not have been evenly shared, still has its kind of huge pockets of poverty. India is one of the wealthiest countries in the world, and the mass impoverishment of India, I think this is kind of one of Britain's great colonial crimes, is the mass impoverishment of India, which places, and the kind of the reordering of Indian agriculture to cater for exports and commodities, takes a kind of a complex social systems and makes them monolithic, simplistic, and shaky and vulnerable. As the book Late Victorian Famines points out, when kind of El Nino effects hit India at the end of the 19th century, it leads to mass famines in the tens of millions. So what happens when a country like Britain ceases to become a kind of the largest empire in the world, when its empire goes into decline? Well, I think if you ignore sort of everywhere else and just look at Britain does three things. Firstly, it stops being a military superpower. Britain's military superpower during the Second World War is based on its ability to mobilise several million Indian soldiers, other colonial soldiers as well, but mainly Indian, Sikh, Muslim and Hindu soldiers. And this is how Britain can assure itself that it can fight multiple wars, because it's got this huge reserve of manpower. This goes into decline in about, this becomes impossible finally in about 1946, when in a bid to have essentially vengeance on the members of the Indian National Army, led by Subhas Chandra Bose, who died in 1944. The British tried to put veterans of the INA on trial, and there's widespread revulsion across India, even from men who fought in the British Army against the INA. And the response is that these are men who are fighting for their country. If in the eyes of some Indians, misguidedly supporting the Japanese, they were still fighting for their country and shouldn't be persecuted after the war. The British at that point already had quite a shaky control over the Indian army, and they lose it entirely in 1946. And it's that act, more than anything else, that convinces the British that well, the jig is up in India. If you can't control, have a monopoly on armed force, then you're kind of done for. So when that comes to an end, and then in the 50s and 60s, most of Britain's African colonies go, Britain resorts to a means of extending imperial control by other means, which is again what we only think of as neocolonialism. What you want to do is continue the flow of wealth from the global south to the City of London, and that's easily achievable through ensuring at least friendly regimes come into power. Those that are biddable, easy to manipulate, those that can be corrupted, those that can't be corrupted but can be undermined. There's a kind of a roaring trade in white mercenaries across Africa, all who have drinks with people like David Stirling in the Claremont Club in the 1970s. Stirling himself thought that there was a means of kind of having a British Empire 2.0 kind of wild geese style, and occasionally toppling an African dictator who wasn't going to behave himself to be replaced with a more pliant one. So there was throughout the 70s and perhaps even into the 1980s, there was a view that imperialism would never take the shape again that it did in the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. But the City of London could still benefit handsomely through a network of neo-colonial relations. The support for certain highly unpopular regimes, such as South Africa and more latterly Israel, is evidence of that. Material, propaganda, and intelligence assistance offered to both states, because they were engaged in fighting a plethora of national liberation struggles, both in the Middle East and in Southern Africa. The adherence to the institutions set up at the end of the Second World War, which, arguably didn't benefit Britain anywhere near as much as they benefited America. The Bretton Woods institutions of the IMF, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, which later becomes the World Trade Organization. All of these have become absolutely devastating tools in keeping the global south poor. Particularly the use of debt and debt repayment and the politics of debt, which maybe is worth talking about another time. But I think one of the explanations for neoliberalism in the global north is the gradual decline in control over the global south. So if capital needs to keep making returns, and it becomes harder and harder to make returns, even under neocolonial conditions, in the global south, well, you look to where finding profits or seeking out profits is easiest. And gradually, capitalist elites in the global north begin to kind of devour their own societies through things like privatization and the gradual diminishment of welfare states, particularly after the end of the Cold War. You don't have to worry about the Soviet Union anymore. You don't have to worry about the threat of a kind of a revolutionary left in your own backyard. And so the purpose of neoliberalism for financial institutions over the long historical view, where we're talking over a matter of decades, is to find alternatives to the excessive profits, the huge profits that came from empire. And this is perhaps why neoliberalism arrives fully fledged to go at the point that it does in the late 1970s, at this moment of kind of crisis across the Western world, where we see a decade when there have been two oil shocks, and at the end of that, there is an elite kind of project unfolding, with kind of middle class support. There is a kind of a section of the Conservatives supporting middle classes in not just in Britain, in a number of first world countries, who look at the 1970s and see it as a decade, firstly, where the left has achieved too much socially and politically, and that a combination of the kind of the economic violence of free markets, the whittling away of social welfare, and the use of police, state violence almost to police all of that, is combined until you have this strange combination of economic liberalism and social conservatism, which is a kind of a pretty toxic mix. Doesn't sit very well together. So the purpose of that is, from a long historical view, to take not the interests of the imperial power, but the interests of the elite class of the imperial power, and to maintain them in a time where it becomes harder and harder to find those ongoing returns through empire. Some of the architects of neoliberalism were pretty explicit about how they viewed the world system to operate, and they talk in quite openly colonial terms. I don't think people like von Mises and Friedrich Hayek and Wilhelm Röpke thought it necessary to garrison third world global south countries with European and American soldiers in order to extract wealth from them. Thought this was not at all necessary. But what you did need to do is intervene to ensure that a certain kind of order existed. Global South countries were there to be producer countries, not consumer countries. And the big problem for a producer country, say Bangladesh, that produces lots of rice, the big problem, and what you don't want to happen, is for there to be a national liberation movement in Bangladesh. Because what you might get, or Bangladesh or Vietnam, or countless other countries, what you might wind up with is a very independent-minded government that says, we're exporting our rice for next to nothing, our people remain poor, and there's high child mortality. If we put up the price by just 10%, infant mortality would come down by 50%. That being the sort of calculus. Let's do it. And that, in the eyes of the neoliberals, would upset the kind of the global web of price signals. Now, that's the charitable way of looking at their views. The arguments that they came up with actually after the end of the Cold War were more explicitly eugenic and more explicitly racial. People like Murray Rothbard, for example. All of this, all of this is drawn from two books by Quinn Slobodian. Firstly, The Globalists, and secondly, Hayek's Bastards, which is almost like a kind of a sequel. What they thought about kind of countries in the global north, post-imperial countries, were that what you needed to do was break the power of organised labour. That's what was going to prevent the idealised world they had in mind coming about. The sort of deal that Thatcher and Reagan gave to populations was essentially give up on labour organising, trade unions, that kind of thing. Give all that up. And in return, we will grant you improving living standards, stable societies, national pride, and law and order, and good stuff all round. All of which, of course, in different guises and in different ways, fails to happen. The advocates of Margaret Thatcher, the defenders of Margaret Thatcher, talk about all the things she got right. But when you actually examine the record, the gamble on monetarism, on restricting the money supply to bring down inflation, to save the investments of Tory voters, at the expense of skyrocketing unemployment. We had unemployment which was approaching, or actually even eclipsing, 1930s levels at the start of the 1980s. It's all artificially created. However, by late 1980, early 1981, it was becoming clear, into 1982, that inflation hadn't been defeated. So you had basically the worst of both worlds, mass unemployment, and the way in which Thatcher dealt with mass unemployment is that she essentially subsidised it. The North Sea oil revenues were spent on income support for mass unemployment, but the purpose of mass unemployment was to break union power, which she finally succeeds with the defeat of the miners' strike in 1984.
Whoever said fork in the road must have been hungry for the Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid. Their 3-row seating and 10-year 100,000-mile limited powertrain warranty. With a capable Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid, every way forward is the right way. Visit your local Kia dealer today. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Drive safely. See retailer for warranty details.
Every day as a small business owner feels like solving a puzzle. One moment you're cruising along, and the next there's a shipping snag that has you scrambling. But here's a surprise you will like. With Progressive, small business owners save 10% or more on their commercial auto insurance when they pay in full. So go ahead, surprise yourself. Get a quote in as little as 8 minutes at ProgressiveCommercial.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
So the way in which elites seek to perpetuate their power and seek to perpetuate their grip on the accumulation of wealth and the ownership of capital and the attempts to prevent its democratization, both in the global south and in the global north, have had these fairly ruinous consequences. And perhaps one of the great kind of tragedies of the post-war era has been this process that we're talking about today, this process of empire notionally going into retreat, but not really. and that in countries, for example, Ghana, which had under Nkrumah a period of development, a period where the possibility of an independent direction in world history was possible, but ends, of course, with a CIA-backed and MI6-backed military coup. And the kind of the mirror picture in the global north is a transition from relative liberal democracy, much of which was paid for in European countries by by the kind of the last flickers of imperial plunder, and from kind of various, as I said, various sort of post-colonial relationships. The NHS in 1948 is financed in part by the wealth generated by Malayan rubber. In addition to that, so you have that social democratic compact going into decline, and being replaced by neoliberalism, which was an innovative means of ensuring in uncertain times that global north societies could be cannibalized and their social democratic institutions be watered down and abolished, that things like consumer debt could be used to boost corporate profits, to debt lending and borrowing deregulation, and in total you find that the winner once again, as it was during the centuries of formal imperial rule, is financial capital. Was it thus? Anyway, I'm going to leave you there, and we'll get back into looking at Congo, I think tomorrow. And yeah, looking forward to speaking to you then. Take good care all. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Explaining History. This podcast is an independent production, and it's listener support that keeps these conversations going week after week. If you find value in the show and want to help cover the costs of research and production, please consider making a contribution. You can join our community on Patreon or make a one-off donation. Just follow the links in the show notes for this episode. Every bit of support is truly appreciated. Thanks again for listening.